The Shroud of Turin, a mysterious religious relic. Many believe it shows the true face of Christ.
There are many faithful who would look at it and know somehow in their hearts that it is something of Christ.
Some believe this is the material used to cover Christ after his death.
I do think that we're dealing with the actual burial cloth of Jesus.
But according to science, it is nothing more than a medieval fake.
The way in which the image was formed is almost as big a mystery as the shroud itself.
In the 1980s, scientific tests dismissed the shroud as a 14th century forgery.
The 1350s is the first time that Western Christendom is aware of the shroud.
But one man disagrees. He believes such a unique artifact needs to be examined in a unique way.
When I began to see the shroud, I felt a sense of infinity.
This scientist has spent his life examining the Shroud of Turin. But can he prove that it's the burial cloth of Christ? Turin, Italy, 1968. A young boy, Giulio Fanti, is holidaying in the city with his parents. His guidebook circled with places he wants to visit.
When I was 12, I went to Turin. I read in a guidebook that in Turin there was the shroud. I was very curious to see it, and I went directly to the chapel.
But young Fanti is disappointed on his trip.
When I entered the church, they told me that the shroud was closed. It was not possible to see it.
The shroud is rarely on display to the public. Usually it is sealed in a climate-controlled box within the chapel.
During the 20th century, there's only been 4 expositions or showings of the shroud, an average of about once every 25 years.
Although young Fanti is not able to see the shroud, the experience makes a big impression.
The only thing I could do was to buy a photograph of the Turin shroud that I have hung in my room.
This begins a lifelong fascination with this mysterious object. Jerusalem, 33 AD. Jesus is accused of blasphemy and condemned to die by crucifixion. He endures many wounds. He's flogged. A crown of thorns put on his head and nailed to a cross. A lance also pierces his side. Once dead, he is laid to rest in a tomb.
All the Gospels tell us that he was buried in a clean linen cloth. John's Gospel has got lots of detail about the cloths that were used in the burial of Jesus.
After 3 days, some disciples inspect Jesus' tomb. They don't find his body, only the burial shroud.
If you look at John's Gospel, it says that John and Peter ran to the tomb. Peter goes in and sees the linen that's lying there in the tomb. There's a wonderful line in John's Gospel which said, he saw and he believed. So he saw something there. Was it the shroud with the image of Christ on it? Perhaps.
Many believe that the Turin shroud is the burial cloth of Christ. But Fanti discovers the authenticity of the shroud is fiercely disputed.
The shroud is a particular object that opens many debates because it is an interesting object from a scientific point of view, but it is also interesting from a religious point of view.
Fanti finds that many are suspicious of the shroud's origins. This is due to its sudden appearance in the Middle Ages.
The relic first appeared in the 1350s when it was exhibited in the French town of Lire. It appears as if from nowhere. And when it's exhibited, no explanation is given, or at least none has been recorded, as to where it came from.
Exploring the historical archives, Fanti discovers the shroud was incredibly popular. However, he finds that within the church, there were doubts about the shroud's authenticity. A bishop from a nearby church wrote to the Pope about his suspicions.
The 1389 letter from the bishop to Pope Clement is a very important document because in it, Bishop Peter says that he has seen evidence of an inquiry 30 years earlier by a predecessor of his, Henry of Poitiers, who said that he had found the painter who had forged the shroud and he had recorded a formal verdict that it was a forgery.
Fanti is struck by the skepticism shown by this man of God. But he can also see that the bishop's motives may not have been entirely pure.
There may have been a revenue question. He would rather pilgrims didn't go to see the shroud, but came to see relics in one of his churches.
Skeptics believe the shroud was forged to satisfy a huge demand for Christian relics.
Manufacturing relics was a sort of major industry in the medieval period. There are enough vials containing the tears of Christ in Europe to float the Titanic.
And a relic capturing the body of Christ just before his resurrection would be the ultimate attraction.
A relic like the Turin shroud is a first-order relic. It's a relic related to Christ himself. So in terms of the value of that as a relic, it's very significant.
Fanti can see that if a church had an important religious relic, it would boost the economy of the area.
One of the biggest sources of income for churches came in the form of pilgrims. Pilgrims came and they stayed and they bought. So the quality of the relics in a town was often the determining factor in the amount of pilgrim trade and traffic that they would get.
The suspicion that the shroud was a medieval forgery stuck and remained unchanged for 500 years. By the 19th century, for most Christians, the Turin shroud is nothing more than a comforting curiosity. Turin, Italy, 1998. Since his visit as a young boy, Giulio Fanti has grown up and become a professor in engineering. After a 30-year wait, Professor Fanti returns to Turin. This time, he is able to witness the shroud with his own eyes.
The first time I saw it was in 1998 during the exhibition, and this was a particular moment for me because I have already begun some studies, and I wanted to be sure that the shroud was authentic.
Professor Fanti wants to dedicate his life to uncover the secrets of the shroud. So there, before the shroud, he asks if he is doing the right thing.
I put a clear question to the man of the shroud, and looking at the shroud for some minutes, I had a quite clear answer. A very personal answer that I felt into myself. This was very clear.
This religious experience inspires Professor Fanti to commit himself to the shroud. He focuses his research on the modern history of this religious relic. The professor starts with the first breakthrough in unlocking the secrets of the shroud.
1898 opened the scientific period for the Turin shroud.
Unexpectedly, Italian authorities grant a photographer a unique opportunity.
Secondo Pia made the first photographs of the shroud.
His first attempt at photographing the shroud ends in failure. His negatives are underexposed. But 3 days later, he has one more chance to photograph the shroud. What he captures changes the way the world sees the shroud forever.
Looking at the negative, you suddenly could see the image on the shroud in the way that we conventionally see in normal life human beings, with white highlights and dark shadows instead of the reverse, dark highlights and light shadows. And suddenly seeing the shroud as you would see in a normal photograph raised tremendous interest.
After languishing for centuries as a minor curiosity, the shroud is now one of Christianity's most iconic relics.
There are many pieces of linen in the church that represent Christ's image in some way, like Veronica's veils. So the shroud was one among many. But Secondo Pia's photography catapulted it into a different category.
After 400 years, the question is raised again, giving renewed hope to Christians around the world. Is the shroud real after all? Turin, Italy, 1978. The church allows the most extensive scientific examination of the shroud to a group of scientists who call themselves STIRP.
STIRP was a non-profit organization set up to perform scientific studies on the Shroud of Turin. It stands for Shroud of Turin Research Project.
The scientists are determined to uncover the truth behind the shroud.
Thorpe made the most important research from a scientific point of view.
The scientists know that this is an historic event. And they have been waiting months for this moment.
The shroud was brought to us covered in red silk into the test room, which is the royal palace. The shroud was then transferred to the testing platform, and then we had to prepare it for the scientific testing.
The scientists only have 5 days to conduct their experiments. They work day and night to discover everything they can about the shroud. Some sleep, while others carry out even more experiments.
What we did were things like scientific photography. We would take photographs, color, black and white. We did microscopic photography, X-ray fluorescence measurements on the shroud. So the various atoms would glow with their characteristic set of X-ray emissions with a lot of spectral structure to them.
With time ticking away, the team shift gears from high to low-tech experiments.
We took sticky tape samples from the shroud, where you take sticky tape, non-contaminating tape, pressure-sensitive roller, so as to control the pressure. Adhering to the tape sample would be particles from the shroud.
After 120 hours of non-stop examinations, the clock runs out, and the shroud returns to the chapel for another decade. Colorado, USA, 1981. It has been 3 years since Stirp conducted their tests. John Jackson and his team are finally able to release their findings.
We gave ourselves 3 years. We took a condition of secrecy because we didn't want to have half-baked stuff getting out there. So 3 years later, 1981, we then released all the information. We weren't searching for sensationalism. We thought that would be the responsible way to do it.
Professor Fanti is astonished at the findings. Stirp tested whether a forger first painted the ghostly image of a man and then added red stains to simulate wounds to the body. But Stirp find the red stains were definitely not paint. They were human blood.
The blood stains were incrustations, reddish incrustations on top of the cloth.
But did a forger splatter the blood across the cloth to create the wounds? Fanti does not see evidence of that. On the contrary, the blood distribution exactly matches the pattern of wounds Christ would have sustained during his crucifixion. A spear wound on one side of the chest, and across the body hundreds of cuts or scourge marks from a Roman flagrum.
Along the whole image, but in particular in this part of the dorsal image, we see the blood stains deriving from the scourge marks. 300 scourges along the whole body.
There was no evidence that an artist had forged the wound marks. But could a clever painter have forged the image of the body? If a forger had, then the paint should have soaked right through the shroud fibers. But when Stirp examined the cloth, the body image was only on the very surface.
There was no obvious pigments making up the body image. The body image on the shroud lies only on the surface of the cloth. The color of the image, the body image, does not go through the thickness of the cloth.
Professor Fanti wants to see if he can himself confirm Stirp's observation. He examines the shroud image with a microscope, down to the individual fibers.
So to try to understand the peculiarities of the shroud image, enlarge it about 300 times. we obtain this model.
This model represents one thread of the shroud. Each thread is made up with flex fibers.
In this model, we see about 100 flex fibers. Some of them are colored, image fiber, a red one, and non-colored, this one.
If it had been painted, the entire thread would have been soaked through. Instead, only the top fibers are stained.
This is a very difficult task for a hypothetical painter, because we must think of one brush having one point smaller than the fiber. A fiber is about 15 micrometers.
The professor believes that the image resting on the microscopic fiber means a painter could not have created the shroud.
With this brush, he has to paint the front of the fiber, the back of the fiber, without touching the adjacent fiber. He would have to paint millions of fibers, one by one, in order to obtain these results. That is impossible.
For Fanti, Stirp has shown that the shroud in all likelihood is not a forgery. But is it actually the burial cloth of Christ? The Vatican, Rome, 1988. It's 10 years since Stirp's famous experiments, and people are now calling for a carbon dating test. They want to prove once and for all that the Shroud of Turin is from the time of Christ. But the Catholic Church refuses to play ball, as the test requires the shroud to be cut and the samples burned. After long and delicate negotiations, the Vatican at last gives permission.
Essentially, it's a dating method for living materials. So what you have to do is to get out the carbon that you're sure was in the object when it was first formed. In the case of textile, it would be the cotton fibres or the flax from which the material was made. And what you're actually dating is the growth of those fibres.
On the 21st of April 1988, under supervision of the Vatican, the shroud is cut. Samples are sent to 3 laboratories around the world, in Tucson, Oxford, and Zurich.
Normally, if you've got an object that you want to find the age of, you would send it to a single lab. But for something as controversial as this, I think the feeling was that you should have more than one lab doing the measurements independently to check that the results were similar.
The results are kept secret until October the 13th. It is then, with great fanfare, the results are announced to the world. The shroud is a forgery.
What it tells us pretty unequivocally is that the sample measured was medieval and within precision of a century or so.
All 3 labs reached the same conclusion with a 95% accuracy. The shroud originates from either the 13th or the 14th century. Fanti is devastated to read the headlines in the press.
I remember that I read many newspapers with their titles on the front page declaring that the shroud is a fake.
The results are also a blow for Christians all over the world.
Immediately after the carbon date results came out, there was a sense in which let's not bother exploring this cloth much more because, although it's very interesting, it is medieval and it doesn't relate directly to Jesus.
and anyone who dares question the carbon dating results faces ridicule.
Since the carbon dating, there is this sense in which people who believe in the shroud are flat earthers. So if you've got a professional reputation as a professor and you continue to explore and to examine the shroud, then obviously it can be difficult for you.
But it's not difficult for Professor Fanti. Since first laying eyes on this religious object, he is willing to do everything he can to discover the true age of the shroud. Padua, Italy, 1988. It's 10 years since the carbon dating test labeled the shroud a fake. But Fanti knows that the image on the cloth could not have been forged by a painter. This is a major contradiction. And something tells Fanti it's not the end of the story.
When I read this title, I was quite dubious. Something in my heart told me that the shroud was not a fake.
Fanti is prepared to carry out his own research, but he knows only too well that he cannot let his beliefs cloud his scientific work.
We have to proceed in a clear way, separating as much as possible scientific aspects from religious one. And this was the way I followed from the beginning.
Fanti suspects that somewhere along the line there's been a mistake in the carbon dating. He wonders if anything in the shroud's history could have distorted the result. (1532). The shroud is stored in a chapel in the Alps. And one night, the chapel catches fire.
In 1532, the only damage to the shroud that has ever occurred that we know of took place. There was a raging fire in the chapel. At the time, the shroud was kept in a silver reliquary in a locked box. Strenuous attempts were made to rescue the shroud from the fire. By the time they'd managed to smash open the box, the heat inside was so intense that some of the silver had melted and had burnt through the shroud. So those burn holes can still be seen.
The shroud survives the fire. Steps were quickly taken to repair it, not with ancient thread from the time of Jesus, but with medieval thread.
Immediately after the fire, the shroud was given to an order of nuns. The nuns repaired the shroud. They mended the areas which are on the shroud by the image itself. They had to reweave some of the fibers of the shroud in order to repair the damage.
Fanti wonders if the samples in the carbon dating test contained thread from the Middle Ages and contaminated the result. Oxford, England. The home of the Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit, one of the labs that tested a sample from the shroud in 1988. Could the medieval carbon date be wrong? Although the tests destroyed the samples, the Oxford lab still has photos of them. Pam Moon, who, like Fanti, has doubts about the carbon dating result, asks the Oxford lab to release the photos. She wants to inspect the front and reverse image of the shroud sample.
The Oxford pictures have been really, really helpful in the sense that they're actually quite detailed. There's quite a lot that you can see in them.
The lab releases every single image that they have of that sample. As she carefully inspects the photos, Pam Moon spots some unusual signs.
At first glance, it looks like it's really good condition, but it looks like there's a shadow.
But a photograph of the reverse of this material reveals that this was not a shadow.
What it shows is that what looks like a bit of shadow is actually a deep stain, and there's staining all over the sample. It shows signs of hand weaving, invisible repair. It shows a different tension in different parts, heat damage, so it's shrunk. So obviously this is a hugely contaminated piece of cloth.
Fanti is convinced that discoveries like Pam's challenge the accuracy of the carbon dating result. He would love to see the carbon dating test rerun, but he can't. The original samples are gone, and for decades, the Vatican has refused to release any more shroud fragments.
From the carbon dating, officially there are not open experiments on the shroud. All was closed up to now.
Professor Fanti is facing a dead end. Without any material to test, he is unable to conduct his experiments. Can he find another way to discover the true age of the shroud? He goes back into history. He discovers an illustration of a shroud of Christ before the 14th century. A Hungarian text, the Prey Codex, has an image of Jesus lying on a shroud with its trademark herringbone weave. And on the shroud, within the Prey Codex, Fanti spots 4 circular marks. These are identical to marks found on the shroud. The Prey Codex is reliably dated to the 12th century, at least 100 years before the carbon date. It means the Turin shroud might have existed long before the carbon date says it did. It means the carbon date could be wrong. As Fanti delves further back through the archives, he discovers many other shroud-like images throughout history.
We know that there were images that look just like the shroud, that date to the 6th century.
And Fanti finds similarities in coins also made from around that time.
This coin represents the face of Christ that has many similarities with the shroud.
For Fanti, all these images are evidence that the shroud existed prior to the Middle Ages. And they convince him that the shroud dates back to the burial of Christ. But how can he prove it scientifically? Padua, Italy. Home to one of Italy's most prestigious universities. Fanti decides that to establish the correct date of the shroud, he can't work alone. There are many scientists around the world working on the shroud. So he decides to set up a group to get like-minded people together.
In 2002, I formed a group called Shroud Science. Shroud Science has many shroud research in the world.
Once in the group, Professor Fanti discovers there is only one way to get your hands on shroud material, and that's to to contact Stirp, the scientists from the 1978 Shroud of Turin research project.
The Vatican recognizes only samples coming from 1978, taken by Stirp.
As head of the Shroud Science Group, the professor approaches every Stirp scientist for samples. He waits for a reply, and one day, an envelope arrives.
The first sample was from Ray Rogers, who was not expert in sending samples.
Immediately, Fanti can see there is a problem.
He put a glass containing image fiber in a simple envelope. There was perhaps an accident during the transportation, and the glass had even been broken with the envelope opened.
If the fiber is gone, the professor's chance to conduct any experiments will be lost. He sifts through the glass, looking for any stray fibers.
Using my microscope, I was able to detect the fiber among the pieces of broken glass. I was very, very lucky to take the envelope and to find the image fiber wasn't there.
With this official piece of the shroud, the professor's experiments to date the shroud can begin. Inside the corridors of Padua University lies Professor Fanti's laboratory. And in here, Fanti finds himself in a unique situation. He possesses a piece of one of Christianity's most worshipped relics. The shroud has fascinated him all of his life. And now he is able to do what others could only dream of doing: run his own series of tests. Fanti devises 3 experiments, quite different to the carbon dating test.
I detected that there are some alternative methods able to make a date of the shroud.
Fanti believes the average of these tests will produce an accurate date.
I'd say it's essential to get as much diversity in your observations that you can to scientifically test a given hypothesis.
The first experiment is a load-bearing test. Every material has a certain strength. This strength degrades over time. How strong the shroud fiber is will show Fanti how old the material is. But such an experiment needs a very specialized machine.
We began to search a machine able to perform the tests. In general, there are many loading cycles machines in the world, but this machine makes tests on threads, not on short fiber like those of the shroud that are 1-2 millimeters long. I searched in the world, but it was not easy to satisfy this condition.
Eventually, Fanti builds his own machine.
So we designed, built, and calibrated a new machine that is able to make this test.
Fanti's machine tests the microscopic shroud fibers. Fanti's results are remarkable. The fiber is 900 years older than the carbon date.
In correspondence of the mechanical dating, we have 400 years old. at a 95% confidence level. This was sufficient to demonstrate that the radiocarbon dating was wrong.
It's an astonishing reversal of fortunes for the Shroud. But 400 AD is still hundreds of years after the burial of Christ. Can Fanti trace the Shroud even further back? Fanti carries out his next two experiments. He uses an infrared spectrometer and a laser. These tests calculate how well the material reflects light. The older the material, the less it reflects it. Fanti runs the tests. Amazingly, the fiber reflects very little light. The fibers date to between 200 to 300 BC, 1,500 years older than the carbon dating test.
Step by step, we arrive to these results that we obtain. Every time we reach the good result, we were obviously happy.
Professor Fanti now has a range of new dates radically different to the Shroud's carbon date. All he needs to do is average his three findings. Fanti's final date is 33 BC, a result that places the Shroud just before the time of Jesus. The world, at last, takes notice of Fanti's work. And it was also recognized by others who have researched the Shroud.
I am aware that he gave a date that would be consistent with it being the burial cloth of Christ. Any research that points in that direction is just great from my point of view.
But for Fanti, it's not the end of his journey. He may have proved the Shroud originated around the time of Christ's burial. But the greatest secret of the Shroud still remains unanswered. How was the extraordinary image on the Shroud created? When pilgrims come to Turin, they're mesmerized by the ghostly figure on the Shroud. But the image on the cloth still puzzles believers and skeptics.
The Turin Shroud is a bit like the Loch Ness Monster, in that it has passionate supporters and skeptics on both sides. Those who say it's a fake have to explain how a medieval person could have created an image that modern science cannot replicate.
Fanti is determined to solve the mystery once and for all. Skeptics have suggested various techniques a forger could have used to make the image: painting, photography, or even a chemical process. But none explain why the image only rests on the surface fibers of the cloth.
There are many hypotheses about the body image formation, but none of them are able to explain all what we see.
Fanti wonders what other natural process could have left such a shallow impression. As a professor in thermal imaging, Fanti is familiar with the effects of electricity. He's intrigued by the electrical or corona discharge created by a plasma ball. On a small cloth, it can create an image simply with an electrical charge over a 24-hour period.
Now, if I touch the sphere, we see a connection with my finger and a discharge. To reproduce an image like that of the shroud, we can use a linen cloth put on the sphere, and if with my hand I touch the linen, you can see the image on the sheet. If I stay for a while in this position, an image generates on the linen that has many characteristics that are very similar to that of the shroud.
But Fanti wants to see if the experiment works using a figure of Christ and a large cloth. That means increasing the charge to hundreds of thousands of volts.
It is a quite complex process. We need high voltages that generate the high electric fields that ionize the gas.
For days, Fanti works with deadly amounts of electricity. But the experiment ends in failure.
The first time I went to make the experiments, I was curious, but my curiosity stopped soon because the result was negative.
The charge has left no marks on the cloth at all. He tries again. This time Fanti turns up the power to nearly 100%, and he bombards the cloth with electricity for more than 24 hours. The adjustments work. When he returns, an image has formed.
It is necessary to calibrate very well the energy. Only in the range 97, 98, it is possible to obtain an image.
When Fanti examines the image, he is amazed. It's the closest image he has ever seen to the one on the shroud.
The corona discharge gives us the most number of compatibility between the experimental results and what we see on the shroud.
It is 15 years since Fanti stood before the shroud asking for divine guidance. And it's even longer since a childhood trip triggered an obsession with the shroud. The results of his remarkable experiments are a vindication of his life-changing decisions. For Fanti, the Shroud of Turin is not a medieval forgery. It could very well be the burial cloth of Christ. But as he admires the relic, he can't help wondering if it is the Shroud of Christ. What in the 1st century AD could have produced such a massive electrical blast? As Fanti reviews his tests, the only hypothesis he can think of is also the most controversial. The blast was created by a divine miracle.
I think that the most important message of the shroud is that it enveloped a resurrected man.
Fanti believes that if the Turin shroud is the burial sheet of Christ, then it also depicts his resurrection.
If the Shroud of Turin is the burial cloth of Jesus, then it would be his resurrection cloth as well. Is that what the shroud is? Is that what it's telling us?
For Fanti, the shroud as a depiction of the resurrection is confirmation of his faith.
The demonstration that a second life after this life exists.